Fake news.
Wrong.
Fake news. Wrong. Hello, this is the QUACKCAST. I'm Ozone Ocean, and with me is Baines and Tance. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
This is QUACKCAST number 467. So what we're talking about now is adaptations, which is interesting. So adaptations in all the different forms. So, you know, pop culture things where we've seen stuff turned from one thing into another, you know, like from a book or a comic into a movie, into a play, into a musical, into a game. You know, things can transition to all these different forms back to your book again or whatever, and the changes as it goes, and these changes create new kind of versions of this thing, or it creates like something that's even more interesting than the original version. So yeah, adaptations, it's quite an interesting subject. Things mutate and transform through adaptation. But before we get into that, I have to bring up the featured comic. I featured a comic this week called Hyperbolic Fabrications Presents. So this is an interesting feature. Take it away, me, with that. Hello, I'm Ozone Ocean, and my feature for the week was Hyperbolic Fabrications Presents. We begin with Trigger Warning, a story about Nathan Wood, prisoner of the mysterious institution. This mild-mannered man seems prone to horrific acts of violence. But why? Who is keeping him imprisoned? Then we dive straight into our second tale. They were wolves. In a small armed village, two young children, Zara and Bobo, run carelessly. They play harmlessly, enjoying their youth and innocence. Zara is headstrong and bold. Bobo is timid and wary. This peaceful scene is about to be shattered. All the art is in black and white and drawn with a pen. It's sketchy, richly detailed, and heavily stylized. The stories are full of action, tension, and suspense. There are only 2 short stories in this comic so far. I believe Hyperbolic Fanfiction Presents is like an overall title for many short stories to be published under. So they're all going to be under the same account. So you get like these short, little, contained stories, one after the other, which is quite interesting. So you can become invested in it, and it'll finish, and then maybe it might continue later. That's the nature of these kind of comic accounts. It's rather interesting. Plus, you can get to digest a story very quickly and see a new one and see where that goes. So it's quite nice. Anyway, this is quite good work. It's all by Hyper Fab Mag, and it's rated M. So read it. And that was the featured comic. I hope you enjoyed that featured comic with the rather unusual title of Hyperbolic Fabrications Presents. So next up, we're going to talk about the featured music that Gun Wallace has given us. Gun Wallace has given us the theme to a comic called Trumped, which is, you know, based on an obscure politician. Of course, no one knows about. This music, he describes it as a making of the theme for Trumped, which is quite interesting. You can see what boundless taste and sense of style this fellow has in his choice of theme tunes. No Eleanor Rigby style classical sounding stuff for the blonde haired buffoon. Heavenly choirs and stately piano pieces are far too serious, subtle and stylish and sensible. Nothing less than a bubblegum jingle will please the prez. So yeah, listen to this and be amused. This is a great theme by Mr. Gunn Wallace.
Tremendous, believe me.
Give me something classy, real classy.
Nope. It's a catastrophe, nothing less.
Terrible. Horrible.
Fantastic.
And that was the theme, Trumped, which is a comic by Rawdale, rated M. Have a look at it. It's a great comic. So, adaptations, guys. We did our little Patreon video about this, and we talked about some great adaptations, which were, quite interesting. One of the adaptations that we didn't talk about, that actually, I think, Tarts, you mentioned it, was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Mm-hmm. This is, has a very interesting history regarding adaptations. So the original story is written in the late 19th century by H.G. Wells. It's about Mars and about the idea of alien technology, aliens coming down to Earth and destroying 19th century London or 19th century Britain. And, the power of the most powerful empire the world has ever known being laid low by superior technology, and then that superior technology being laid low by something that's not technological at all, which is in fact the viruses and bacteria and stuff like that, which is a very intelligent idea. But different adaptations have taken this in all different directions in very interesting ways. I was first introduced to War of the Worlds via the Wayans musical. I can't remember the guy who created the Justin Hayward sung it, and there was all different people were part of this. So this was a fantastic multimedia adaptation with these amazing cover art by various, amazing illustrators like Michael Whelan, people like that, and fantastic pop singers of the day. I think this was done in the late 70s or early 80s. So the singers from Moody Blues and all sorts of things. That was Justin Hayward. And so this was done as a live performance and also on a couple of records. And it's a very interesting version of War of the Worlds. So that's one version, and this is taken, that took it like a dramatized this 19th century kind of scene, and it took it in a very we're basing it on these characters and what they're experiencing and how they're reacting to these horrible events, and it's quite horrific in turns, but it's also poetic and beautiful because it's done as like a musical. And the music is very haunting, and it's got amazing narration by Richard Burton, I think. So it's quite affecting, quite emotionally affecting, more so than the book or anything else, because it taps into your senses in these different ways. And of course, there have been other adaptations, other versions. We have a very famous version by Orson Welles, who did the radio play, and that's credited with causing mass hysteria and panic, and people to flee the cities because they were thinking that their United States was actually being invaded. And in that adaptation, he structured it as if it was a news broadcast of something that was really happening. So in the 1930s or the 1940s. Yeah,
I think it was in the 30s.
Yeah, so he's it's as a radio play. He's doing news broadcasts saying, "Oh, and the aliens have landed, and we think they're coming out of the cylinder now, and they're going to. Oh my God, they've just blown up the police car and all that kind of stuff." And it had that sense of reality. So he did it in a very kind of intelligent way because no one else had really done that before, apparently. So yeah, that was a very, very interesting adaptation, setting in the modern day and making it as if it was a real happening on the radio broadcast. So that was his version. There's American sci-fi film versions where they've they set it in like the 70s or the 80s or something like this in modern day America of the time. And all different film versions that I know of War of the Worlds always do that. They always set it in the present day for some reason. There was a Tom Cruise version, so they always do that.
Right.
There's been a video game versions of War of the Worlds where they set it back in the 19th century, but they've done it as a real time strategy. So you have to have they didn't really set it in the 19th century. They set it like in the First World War. So the humans are on par with the aliens. So they've got their technology, so they can humans develop tanks and warships and all this kind of stuff and go against the aliens, and the aliens have their technology. So that was rather interesting. So yeah, War of the Worlds is it's almost never actually set. Like it's always never adapted true to the original story. It's always changed quite a lot for whoever's using it. So that's
and we could say that it was like the mold out of which a lot of aliens are attacking the Earth stories have been inspired one way or the other, especially the ones where the aliens have been watching and studying for a while before they actually do anything. So,
Independence Day is based. You could say it's based on War of the Worlds. It's like a plagiarized version. Stuff like that. Yeah, it's a real template. So it's very influential. I love the versions that are a bit more 19th century. So the musical version and the computer game version, because they take it in another interesting direction. So the adaptations, like the American versions, are really focusing on aliens and attacking. And it's about, aliens. There is a bit of the personal drama, like how do we get away from the aliens? How do we survive? But yeah, there's a lot about aliens attacking. Whereas the musical version is way more about the characters and way more about what has been done to London. And the aliens are like a backdrop. They're not really the focus of that story. They're like this horrible natural disaster. And the real story is the characters' will to survive, and the collapse of society is more of the story. And people who have been influenced by that say, the writer of the Triffids, I can't remember his name, and the Kraken Wakes, John Wyndham. John Wyndham. His stories are very influenced by that, and he takes on from that. His stories aren't about the monster, about the evil that's happening to the world. It's more about how society copes with the collapse. Anyway, I'm I'm digressing into derivative
No,
works.
it's a great segue to talk about adaptations as as a as a general thing, because when you adapt something, then it's up to the adapter, let's say, to choose to focus in the same things on the same things that the original work did, or focus on something else. And usually, most adaptations focus on whatever is more of interest at the particular point in time when the adaptation is being made. So I talked about, your standard great adaptations that came from books like Phantom of the Opera or Les Miserables and Mary Poppins and stuff. If we compare the original works with the adaptations that are high quality adaptations, there is definitely a shift in the lens, let's say. What the author was more interested in doesn't necessarily always coincide with what the adapter was more interested in. And like, for example, if you read the Phantom of the Opera, the original Phantom of the Opera, the book by Gaston Leroux, you will find, of course, a lot of things have been cut out. The reason that the opera is so much like a magic castle is explained in the original, because it was the Phantom himself that built the particular opera. That's why he knew the opera so well. And a series of stuff, it's more like the focus is on the character of the Phantom and two or three extra characters that surround him, more than the mystery itself. And the way it is presented, it is as if it's the found footage of the era, in the sense that it's like a compilation of newspaper clippings and testimonials and stuff, and you read the different news scripts, news scripts and stuff, more than an actual narrative. Like, he went there and he did this. And stuff.
Yeah.
And it's very, very interesting. But it's more like you are doing the anatomy of this character, more than, a romance between him and Christine, and there is also Raoul, who is very creepy in the original, and all of that. Whereas in the musical, it's basically a gothic romance love triangle.
Yeah.
More than anything else. So there's that.
There's different movie versions. There's the famous, I think there's a Dario Argento version that I'm thinking of that's quite horrific. There's a lot of blood and violence in that particular version. And there are other versions too that are taken in a more romantic kind of tone, and so it swings between horror and romance, the two kind of extremes where people will take the Phantom, which is rather fascinating.
And then you have and it's basically it's the same work reimagined or seen through a different lens when you have an adaptation. And sometimes it might be very much in sync, let's say, with the original feel of it. And others, it can be completely heretic and people will hate it. Although it will still be an adaptation, though. So.
Well, Terry Pratchett even did one for his Discworld series, as I vaguely remember, and I could be completely misremembering, but I think in his version, the Phantom is this nerdy guy who's like obsessed with this girl, but really he's just obsessed with the superficial idea of her, and all he really wants to do is create musicals that are saccharine and Andrew Lloyd Webber, Tim Rice kind of stuff, and like bastardize musical theatre and get rid of opera and just turn it into that. So that's how he becomes a true villain.
And now that you mention it, it's very interesting that, for example, in the book, you know the Phantom's real name. It's Eric. In the musical, you never learn that he actually has a name. He's not Phantom. And, he's an actually real person, real, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Because, okay, there are a lot of larger than life situations that he has been through and stuff like that in the original. But you learn about him, whereas in the musical, you don't really learn about him. And if we take it further into the adaptation of the movie, like the adaptation of the musical into a movie, then you learn about his background, which has nothing to do with the original, because you see some flashbacks and stuff that are completely off the original, let's say, character design and character history. But again, you don't learn his name ever.
Interesting.
So,
I'm surprised there has not been a Disney version. I'm actually shocked that there has not been a Disney animated version. 'Cause Disney,
Totally.
It's very surprising.
yeah, they do not shy away from. See, Disney is known for doing their adaptations of things and totally sanitizing it. Totally like sanding off all the rough edges and turning into this smooth, sleek little product. Or plagiarizing things and, turning them into smooth, sleek little product. And that's what Disney does. And they're loved for it. Whether it's their adaptation of Kimba, which became The Lion King. or all their other things, which are, like the Snow White or
the adaptation of Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Yes, that's a great one. Yeah, so Hunchback of Notre Dame. So that is very much like the Phantom of the Opera. And yeah,
and that's another thing. And the focus that Victor Hugo had on that was absolutely not the, marginalization of minorities and stuff like that. His issue was that Notre Dame, the cathedral, was in disrepair. And what he wanted was to make the French, shape up the monument. So you can imagine that it's a completely different approach, let's say.
Yeah.
And also the ending is completely bleak. Spoiler, I guess. And the thing is that in the adaptation of Disney, I think it's a bad one, but it had the potential to be really, really good, because they do not commit to what kind of adaptation they want to do. A serious one that tackles certain adult themes, or one for kids.
Yeah.
And I don't think that movie did well. Maybe that's the reason. Yeah, because it did have quite a bit of darkness in it, but they didn't fully commit to that. There was some silliness and goofiness and songs, but also it was pretty grim in parts. Yeah, strange one.
I would say, especially for that one, and when I saw it in the cinema, I hated it. But I saw it lately, like recently, and if you cut out all the scenes where it has those insufferable gargoyles and the slapstick that goes with it, and you piece together the rest of the movie, it makes for a very imposing, and I would say even Baroque or not Gothic, but towards the Baroque style film. And the songs are very, very serious because one is about lust and it's very, very sexual. And the other one is about being marginalized and having a very tough time about it. And I don't remember the third one. But these two that are the most memorable ones are very serious songs, as a matter of fact. So
it's interesting. We could do a whole topic just on Disney adaptations because they've gone in many directions with their many
let's do that for next
stories. Yes. Well, let's.
Yeah.
Speaking of Disney, Robin Hood. So Disney did their own particular version, which has been very influential. They had a fox playing Robin and various different animals, basically just taken straight out of their Jungle Book adaptation, which were put into Robin Hood, and that became incredibly influential in the furry world, the world of furry comics, and people, do their derivative works that basically trace back to the Disney version of Robin Hood. But there have been many different versions of Robin Hood, which is apparently originally adapted from a folk song or folk tales from, I think, the 11th or 12th century. It's very, very old story about just an outlaw, not a good outlaw, or just a bad, interesting kind of romantic figure. But he gradually turned into a heroic figure, robbing from the rich, giving to the poor, being a noble dispossessed of his land, and so he joins the ranks of the bandits in the forest, and he wants to do good things, and he wants to support the good King Richard against evil King.
Lionheart.
What's that? Yeah, Richard the Lionheart against evil King John. King John was bad and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's people have taken it into all different directions as they adapted it, because this is a very old story that's been adapted and adapted and adapted in different ways. And in
the thing is,
go on.
Oh, you go. No, you go.
No, well, okay, so we've got the famous Errol Flynn movie, and of course Kevin Costner and all sorts of different things, and it keeps on being adapted. There was a Guy Ritchie film recently, and that took it in another direction again, which people didn't like because that modernized it a bit too much in this weird kind of modern fantasy.
And the Gladiator guy did, or was it that? The guy that played in Gladiator, and I forget his name now.
Oh, of course. The Australian, well, he's actually a New Zealander. What's his name? Russell Crowe.
Oh, yeah, that's the one. He also played Robin Hood.
Yes, I believe he did. Yes, New Zealander, everyone. He's not Australian. He's a New Zealander. Yes, he did. So anyway, go on with what you were saying.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that the interesting thing about Robin Hood is that throughout the adaptations, he has one thing that has remained constant from that original first poem all the way to now. It's that he is an outlaw, definitely, breaks the law and stuff, but has his personal code up to there. All the other stuff isn't the original design, character design. It's the additions that have come later. And what is very interesting is that you can see what was popular at every time and every era that it was adapted. Because that's the extra stuff that was added there. And
True. It gives you a snapshot of the tastes of the day.
Like, for example, it is said, and
he's wearing parachute pants in one of the versions.
Yes, I remember that. It's quite embarrassing. But...
He had a mullet. Yeah, stuff like that. Shoulder padded.
Flared, skinny
Miami
tie,
Vice
huge
suit.
collar.
Yeah.
The stuff about him being a noble, Robert of Locksley and stuff, emerged around Elizabethan times, where all the heroes had to have, noble blood, even if they were very, very much down in their luck or whatever. So, or for example, the whole thing with being during King Richard / King John's era, that came later, even later on, that when they needed the guy to be rooting for the good king versus the bad king and stuff. So the politics entered later, let's say, even later than the nobility, and the giving to the poor was added when he had to be doing specific, very virtuous things consistently, and not whenever it suited him, because originally he helped whenever he wanted to help and didn't really have any set of criteria, and definitely didn't distribute wealth. So
Right.
there's that.
Yes, he eventually becomes a freedom fighter, sort of vigilante, kind of like proto superhero, a Batman kind of figure. Well, not Batman, no, but one of the other kind of superheroes that's more virtuous and helping the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but Arrow is Arrow, the TV series, which is based on a particular character. The character's not called Arrow, is it? It's called Green Arrow.
It's probably based on Green Arrow. Yeah.
Yeah. So Green Arrow is based on Robin Hood, of course. Yeah, very much so. If you've seen his depiction, the depiction of Green Arrow in the original comics is very much a Robin Hood romantic image of Robin Hood, deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that has there's a difference between adaptation and derivative stories, isn't there? Because derivative stories are not directly, they don't give the character the same name, they don't give the character the same setting. They take a small part, or they change enough about a character in order to be called a derivative work rather than an adaptation or adaptation. But
yeah, because they are more inspired by the original material rather than seeking to be part of the franchise, let's say, or the brand.
So yeah, that's there's a difference there, but it definitely did influence it. So yeah, it has been an interesting character used in a very political sense, in order to say, oh yeah, this character is for the poor and he's for the oppressed against this corrupt aristocracy. And they make a big deal out of it, not just the bad King John, but we have the Sheriff of Nottingham being a corrupt policeman kind of thing, because that's his job. Working for Guy of Gisborne, I think, is the main kind of antagonist there. And yeah, they're being quite antagonistic to good old Robin Hood and the people who they levy unfair taxes from, which is why Robin has to go and take from them and redistribute the wealth.
There are also the corrupt priests, and the abbot usually is corrupt and an evil guy. And if anyone takes the story as far as Robin Hood's death, he is consistently done in by an evil member of the cloth, either an evil nun or an evil priest. So there's that.
Against the good priest, who is Friar Tuck. I don't know when he got added. I didn't think he was the original character, but he's a popular character. So Friar Tuck is a friar, so a Franciscan monk. Well, not a monk. He is Franciscan, but he's not a monk. He is like an itinerant kind of sort of semi-priest who goes around and ministers to the poor and stuff like this. But he is not very religious in the way he acts. You know, he's greedy, and he drinks and all this kind of stuff. So he's an amusing character. He's meant to be quite funny in the way he acts. But he supports Robin, so he's a good religious character because he's irreverent and he acts like in a way that the poor kind of people who the character's meant to be like Robin's meant to be for, they would approve of Friar Tuck in his drunken, greedy ways. It's just quite interesting. All these characters are particular archetypes, aren't they? But yeah, they're used in all sorts of different ways. Yeah, they like you said, Tance, they're added for a particular reason because of the fashions of the day, and to express things about the history and the time of which they were added. Well,
yeah, and also, for example, think about the adaptations that we are producing nowadays. For example, I think BBC produced Les Miserables, the musical again, and the way that they cast the characters is a direct reflection of the whole push for inclusivity and diversity, even at the expense of historical accuracy, for example. I think also there was, not I think, I know, I just don't remember the title, a series about the Trojan War, where the way that the adaptation was executed was more intended to cater to diversity than anything else, among other things. So it is very, very reflective of our times, where the whole idea of inclusivity, of being, for example, blind to race or other things, depending on where you land on that, you still have these new adaptations adding to the discussion and adding to the push for or against, depending. So.
Yeah, they did a similar thing with Dracula. That was a recent, I think it was a Netflix version of it. It was British, and they, adapted it in a very interesting way. Dracula has been adapted many times, of course. Vampires were a bit of a fun thing in the 19th century. Of course, the most famous vampire stories in the 19th century were the Varney, the vampire series, and that took the character in a particular way. And then, of course, we had Bram Stoker in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I think. He did his version, which redefined the character again, and we got Dracula from there. And Dracula has been the one that had shot up in popularity, and many different people did different adaptations. Of course, we have different film versions. Most famous of which is like the Bela Lugosi depiction. Just took it in a certain direction that became so iconic that people didn't really adapt from the original story anymore, but they adapted from Bela Lugosi's version. So we had all sorts of different movies, Hammer horrors, stuff like that, based on Bela Lugosi's depiction of Dracula. And most films and spoofs of the series all use that particular version rather than going back to the original story. And, it has changed again. And so this this British version that was on Netflix took it in a very different direction. So they still tell the original story, but they've changed it in certain specific ways in order to make Van Helsing is now a female nun, and she is quite a lot more major character than she was as the male version in the original story. Then they take it into the future, and the Van Helsing character changes again into another particular way. So they did use it in a much cleverer way than, well, not cleverer, but more interesting way than a lot of adaptations have taken it. It's not clever, but it's novel and it's unique. Yeah, it could have been a lot cleverer. Yeah, I think in order to make it cleverer, they should have taken it further and not stuck to the story. 'Cause that's an important thing we haven't really brought up too much, is like sticking really close to the story can be really good in some situations, and in other situations you should really follow your nose and follow your own instincts and change it a bit more. So yeah,
I think that depends a lot on why you are adapting it and what you want to do with this new adaptation. It's about the lens, as we said, because, for example, when in adapting Robin Hood, you gave him noble blood and you added all the background and the scenes and whatever else had to be added in order to get him to be originally noble born. This was a diversion of the story from the original story, and that's I think around there, or at least the way that we know her now, we find Maid Marian as well, because she was his betrothed, and then she became this independent lady that did a lot of stuff herself, and so on and so forth. So.
Oh yeah. So it's the Maid Marian stuff is like it's almost been turned into like a Romeo and Juliet love story. It's one of the most important love stories in like Western. No, not really, but it's like it's brought up as like one of the main kind of love stories.
Mm-hmm. And I think that she's very much overlooked, because she's one of the first actual action girls to talk about the trope. Because if we take away the early 20th century version of her, where she's basically a damsel and she waits and blah.
Yeah.
In previous versions, which is very interesting, like even in the versions around the time Ivanhoe was written, you had her dressing up as a boy in order to travel, not because she wanted to be a boy, but because she wanted to travel safe and go and do certain things. And she is very smart. She knows certain things. She basically drives the plot for a good bit of time when it comes to her and Robin, and she bails him out a couple of times.
Well,
and I think it's unfair that she's overlooked so much, because she was a medieval action girl. Actually written as an action girl.
She had quite a big role in the TV series Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, which is a British TV series starring Tony Robbins, who people will know as Baldric from Blackadder, as the Sheriff of Nottingham. And Maid Marian in that is, of course, the main character. Robin is a side character. That was a really great, fun TV series. It was meant to be just for children, but I really liked it and thought the humour was quite clever. So that is something I would recommend. Maid Marian and Her Merry Men.
I have to check it out now.
Yeah, quite fun. Yeah, beware, it is for children and it is silly.
Okay.
But I think it's good enough for
we can
to
have
be
it
enjoyed.
silly, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, there are that's a good example of a version. And this was not done like in like the 2000s as some kind of, very po-faced deliberate diversity thing. This was done in like the early 90s, I think, just for fun. So yeah, and it has got diversity, but not in an on the nose kind of way.
Yeah.
It's just in a clever way, in a more fun way. The guy Danny John Jules, the guy who plays the cat in Red Dwarf, is one of the Merry Men, and various other really fun English actors playing different roles. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it.
Awesome.
Oh, Baines, I sort of talked over you. You were going to say something.
I was?
Yes, I think so.
Oh my! I didn't catch you talking over me at all. I'm not sure. I might have just been hemming and hawing. I guess I have an interest in sort of like a medium like comics, especially in the early kind of modern birth of the comic book movie. I guess in the sort of the beginning of the current kind of situation we have, where it wouldn't necessarily be a franchise, or now a lot of them are going to online series, but where you would take a comic that's been running for decades and try to make it into a movie. Or even a comic's running for a decade and a half, say, like they did Hellboy, they did X-Men, they did Spider-Man. Spider-Man maybe a little bit easier back in the day because, you had an origin story to tell. Now they've told it several times in the movies. But something like X-Men in particular, where you take this comic that's been running for, 50 years at the time, or whatever it was, 40 years. The current crop of X-Men, the more popular version, even that had been running for, 30 years.
Yeah.
And try to turn that into a movie, or a Hellboy thing, which I don't know the comic really well, but my understanding is it was a lot more short standalone stories, a lot of monster hunting, because Mike Mignola loved drawing monsters. So he wanted a monster hunting other monsters, So the movie Hellboy, the original movie, really added a lot of the relationships, like the kind of father-son dynamic.
Oh, really?
With Hellboy and John, whatever the actor's name was, that great actor, John Hurt, I think it is, who played this kind of father figure, leader of the agents, who adopted Hellboy when he was a boy. So that's really interesting to me, like trying to take these long-running things and pare them down. And it's not expanding a fairy tale into a movie, it's the opposite. You're taking this long, sprawling story that's gone through so many different permutations and trying to boil it down to its essence. That's kind of what I was talking about in my news post on this topic, was like you take something, and even if a lot of the details change, finding the essence, which is tough to do, and then trying to find the essence of something that's popular, even harder, because you have to figure out, okay, what do other people see in this? What do most people see in this? Like, why does this have a fandom? And what are people seeing in it? What can I change? What do I have to keep? Kind of thing. So
that's interesting. That's a good point.
That's really cool stuff, Yeah.
Yeah. How?
So done. Yeah.
Oh, go on. I was just gonna say. What is the core that lasts through all these adaptions that you have? Like Spider-Man.
Right. Yeah, like you have to dig in. Like hard to do, I would say. Like to go through a lot of material like that, and say, okay, what is it? Like, is it a metaphor? Is it the metaphor? Is it like this or that about the characters? And kind of mining all that stuff. You have to dig kind of deep, I think, to have a successful adaptation.
Yeah, especially when it's so huge like that. And it's such a multifaceted kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, where do you go with it?
It's done pretty well, I would say. The early superhero, like I thought they distilled X-Men into a good movie, 2 good movies, really, and eventually maybe 3 or 4, maybe, in my opinion. Like did a great job. They took particular stories. They did have to change some details because of various reasons.
Well,
There's been some good stuff and some terrible stuff too. It's kind of funny.
there's been weird pressures that have caused it to change in different ways. So you have different actors playing Mystique, I think. That's played by so different actors playing that character, and so she's taken in different directions depending on how people see this character. Wolverine, played by Hugh Jackman. Wolverine's always been sort of a fan favorite character, but he became even more popular with Jackman's depictions, so he becomes disproportionately represented in the films, and even getting his own film and stuff like this. So yeah, he is just shoehorned everywhere. Jennifer Lawrence's face. She didn't want her face covered up too much, so she wasn't in always depicted as she should have been. The comic version of Mystique is very different from the version in the film. Or films, I should say.
The comic version is different from all of the film versions, I think.
Yes.
Even the Rebecca Romijn version, which I really liked in the early movies, very different from Mystique in the comics. Yeah, he's kind of the leader of her faction of mutants.
Yeah, Tance has just commented here. The star power meant that the characters had to change because Halle Berry has a particular look, that short-haired kind of thing. Whereas Storm in the comics and in the famous X-Men cartoon is very much more regal with long flowing hair. This is not something that Halle Berry does. Halle Berry has her particular look, which is quite different from that. But even so, her depiction of Storm in the movies is great, and people love her. So.
And then there was the harder-edged version of Storm, where she went kind of in a punk direction. She got a lot tougher in attitude. She gave herself a mohawk. This is back in the day. This is 80s X-Men. And she lost all her powers, and that was a storyline for years, I think.
Wow.
Which maybe they'll do that when they bring back the X-Men.
Well,
again, maybe they'll go there with Storm. That'd be interesting.
That's an interesting point in that characters change in a long-running comic like X-Men. It's been going on for decades. So, and this isn't even an adaptation. This is just the comic itself. This character's change to reflect the tastes of the day. So, costume changes, all that kind of stuff. In the movies, that happens as well. So, the first movie was done in the 90s, late 90s sometime, am I right?
Yeah, right around 99, 2000.
Yeah. So they changed to reflect the taste of the day. So they deliberately did not give them the flashy, colourful outfits because that had sort of been ruined by the Batman films, the later versions of the Batman films with George Clooney, I think was the actor who had the misfortune to be in the
Yeah, that might have been part of it. It was getting too silly, too cartoonish. I think another reason at the time would have been they wanted it to be believable.
Yeah.
And they didn't think that, the colorful comic book costumes would play in the movie the way they wanted. That's why that movie kind of starts very realistically. I think it starts in a POW camp, World War II. It's quite realistic, quite gritty. And then it moves into the more fantastical things kind of gradually throughout the movie.
Yeah.
They want you to buy into it. Now, of course, it's the landscape is completely different. They're doing all these crazy. They're doing comic accurate costumes in the Marvel movies, and everything is huge and maybe too big, too cosmic, too cartoonish almost. But people buy it. I also was just a minor point. I remember watching that original movie and then watching some of the later X-Men movies. And my brother and I were talking about, I noticed in the original movie, they avoided using the word powers.
Oh.
Instead of saying powers, they called it gifts. Oh, we are, you're not the only one with gifts. Picard said to Wolverine. And then in Days of Future Past, they're talking about powers. Like, I didn't have my powers, and I just noticed, oh, that's interesting. Like over the course of however many years it was, 10 years or whatever, 12 years, it like really changed. Like now it's they can talk about powers. They can do some of the crazy like time travel stories and everything.
Yeah.
So the world changed.
Yeah, and the adaptations can be a lot more true to the original source material.
Yeah, it would be great if they could stay. I don't know where the X-Men's going to go, but it would be great if they could do the smaller stories too, like stay true to that aspect of the X-Men. What was great about that comic in its heyday was the small stories, the character stories, the out of costume kind of interactions and storylines the characters had was really a huge strength of that comic. And they did a bit of it in the original movie and in Days of Future Past, another one of the better ones, I think, and in Logan, where they're out of costume a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You see them as people, see them in a bar. I think you meet Wolverine in a bar in the original X-Men movie. So that's great. They were able to touch on that stuff. It would be great if they... I mean, can you do everything in movies? I don't know, but like the big cosmic stuff plus the super down-to-earth stuff was always like really cool about the X-Men comic.
Yeah.
In particular.
And, well, it's also been a series of films that has had a troubled history because Marvel hasn't controlled them, and even though this is Marvel, it hasn't been able to be part of the Marvel universe. It's been done by Fox, I think, so...
Yeah, different characters owned by different studios and everything. Yeah, there's different reasons. Focusing on certain characters more than you need to because of the popularity of the actor, I'm definitely not a fan of that.
Oh, yeah. Hugh Jackman's massively popular, so that's what you get.
Well, that is true, but I mean, that was a Wolverine thing in the comics even before the movies existed. Like, there was a focus on Wolverine. Because he was a popular character. Hugely popular character, not just when Hugh Jackman did it. But definitely the Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique thing, and suddenly Mystique is central to everything. It's like, yeah. It kind of works. I'm kind of okay with it.
To say, in the animation version, which was incredibly popular for its time, and I think that brought a lot of people into the series that hadn't been aware of it. It was Rogue and Wolverine that were the main popular characters, and Cyclops as well. But Rogue was the main character with Wolverine, and
they changed her a lot, man, in the movies. Wow,
barely gets a mention in the movies, which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, she's sort of the point of view character in the first movie. Yeah. But she kind of takes a back seat pretty shortly thereafter. And a very different character from the comics. Again, incredibly different. And the cartoon.
Yeah.
I think the cartoon was more like the comic.
Yeah, taking in all different directions. And like, I keep remembering the character Juggernaut was... There's different versions of him in the movies, aren't there? I mean, one of them is played by Vinnie Jones, being like a normal human. And they do... go on.
No, I think that the relationships between the different characters are different. Like, I think Mystique is the mother of some particular... I think Nightcrawler.
Yeah, I think she was revealed to be his mother. Yeah, I think so.
And that has gone out the window, I think, for canon movies, at least for now.
Wasn't she the mother of Rogue?
Sort of a stepmother of Rogue, I think, in the comics. When I read the comics, yeah. But I think later, after I stopped reading, I did hear that she ended up being Nightcrawler's biological mother.
Oh, really?
But that's sort of...
Poor old demonic Nightcrawler.
Yeah.
But,
I would also... Go ahead.
No, go on.
I also think of we can go back to superheroes if you guys want, but Walking Dead, which was a super long running comic and a super long running TV show now. They do a lot of the big moments in the show are right from the comic, but they have to change a lot of details because different characters are still alive in the show that were dead in the comic. So they have to switch characters, and some big characters in the comic, I guess, never existed in the big characters in the show never existed in the comic.
Yeah.
So like Daryl, I don't think ever existed. Daryl and Merle didn't exist in the comic.
Yeah.
Daryl's he's now the main character in the show. So that's neat. Like you get these great moments that are sort of the vision of a single writer or one or two creators, which is the great thing about adapting comics, in my opinion, to shows. Is you can get these unusual, idiosyncratic kind of visions.
And you go with a theme
so
more than the actual like written word, and then you can just play on your own way with that. Okay.
Yeah, or you can even take great story elements. Like I think a lot of the big moments, like I said, actually did happen in the comic, so they're able to dig through and say, "Oh, this is a great moment, so we'll build up to this." Even though it'll be different characters, you can still have like very much the same kind of moment, or the same exact moment, just kind of featuring different people, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of adaptations that went in their own way, one of the movies that I really liked from the 90s was Tank Girl. And it's based on a comic by Jamie Hewlett and I can't remember the other guy. But yeah, completely unlike the comic. Like nothing very much like the comic at all. The only thing it really takes from the comic is the fashion sense of the character. Nothing else. And the fact she drives a tank, you know. There's nothing much between the two versions that's similar. But even though it took the story in it, like it took the character in a very different direction, the movie is still quite iconic in its own right and became a cult film. It wasn't successful in the box office, but since then it became cult because it captured a particular style of the time. See, Tank Girl was kind of created around the fashions, the club fashions in the late 80s and early 90s that the creators of the comic experienced, and they put this in the comic, and the character's attitude was sort of reflective of their own anarchical kind of sense of humor. And so the character in the comics is anarchic. She's amoral, quite evil in some ways, quite vicious, quite violent, in a very comic-y kind of silly way. The way a lot of British kind of anarchic, independent comic characters were. She's not quite really that unique in the way she acts and behaves and her attitudes. So, like a lot of Judge Dredd kind of characters and 2000 AD comic characters sort of behaved exactly the same way. It was just her look that was the main thing. And that's what they took in the movies. They took her look and some aspects of her world, and they created something very different in the movie. So this is a Laurie Petty film, possibly her best film, I would say, because it's a character totally that she inhabited and she created, whereas a lot of other Laurie Petty roles are like supporting characters and things like this, so not so much of herself, whereas this is very much a Laurie Petty character. And so Ice-T was in it as a vicious kangaroo monster.
Wow.
It's quite a silly kind of film, but it captures the fashions and the styles of the 90s and the colourful sense of humour, like craziness of that you see in cult films like Buckaroo Banzai, that kind of thing. So this is a very, very cult kind of silly film, very different from the comic. And a lot of people didn't like the movie because it didn't follow the exact kind of stories and themes of the comic, and it took the the whole story in a different direction. The creators of the comic didn't even like it because of the way it was taken, but it still gained a fan base even so, because people did like this film. People did like this film version and this unique vision, and it still has that. People still do love the film and love the comic as well. People love both those things. I mean, I do myself. I love both those things, even though they're quite different. So that's a good example of an adaptation taking things in a very different direction and splitting the fan base, and it's still creating something that was unique. Conan the Destroyer, Conan the Barbarian, sorry, is another thing. Much loved stories from the 1930s by Robert E. Howard, turned into crappy books after that, and comics that are much loved by some and are not loved by others, and then a movie which is taking things in a very different direction, and it's a great film. It is objectively a fantastic film, but it doesn't follow the books really.
And then there is
comics.
I think there is a second adaptation of Conan that is more recent.
Yeah.
Not with
starring Jason Momoa.
Oh, was it him? I don't remember.
Jason Momoa from the Game of Thrones and Aquaman.
Different approach, different-ish approach. So.
It wasn't liked. It was, and ironically, that is closer to the books. Apparently, I've only seen I saw the start of the film, and it just was so bad that I had to stop it. I couldn't watch it. It was just horrible.
It was supposed to be. They were developing a show for I think it was going to play on Amazon Prime. That was adapting the original books, the Robert E. Howard books, starting with the first one.
Oh, really?
And, it was canceled, apparently. I don't know what's going on with it now, if it's existing somewhere, but yeah, it was apparently.
I believe there have been many failed adaptations. The only truly successful adaptation was the John Milius film Conan the Barbarian. We had sort of a success with Conan the Destroyer, which is very cartoony and a bit more silly and childlike, more of a kid's film. But after that, nothing else really had a success. We had animation versions. I think there was a live action version with this French actor, big tall guy, and again it was more like sanitized, like Conan the Destroyer. So there was video games that never really took off. So it's many different kind of versions of this story that just did not work. Only that Conan the Barbarian has really been a success, and ironically, it was not true to the stories at all, and he didn't really try to make it true to the stories. He took it in his own direction, and it worked. So sometimes that's what you have to do. You can't always stay true to the source material. That won't give you a good adaptation. That won't give you a successful result. Sometimes you really have to follow your own artistic bent to create something better. But often you can create a terrible piece of crap like The Hobbit, but we've got the original story by J.R. Tolkien, which is quite a good story, and then you've got the terrible version by Peter Jackson. But I think that's so bad because rather than following his own artistic vision, there was so much pressure on him to succeed after his success with Lord of the Rings that he tried to make it into like a very typical Hollywood story by just shoehorning in all these kind of things that were meant to be popular, and you're meant to have like an A story and a B story and a C story, which do not exist in the story in The Hobbit and do not make any sense. but he's added them and he's changed the dwarves into romantic figures and handsome and pretty, whereas they're basically comic relief. They're silly. There's some tragedy to the dwarves, but they're not handsome, clever guys at all. That ruins the characters, and the films are just dumb.
At least he should have followed the whole thing about dwarves and the women dwarves, and no, that would have been at least interesting.
What do you mean?
What is
Tell us, please.
Don't you know what the whole thing with the female dwarves is in J.R.R. Tolkien? At least
I haven't read
according
it
to
for 20 years, 30 years. Tell me.
At least he was narrating, I think, if I remember well. I don't think that's only in the movie, but I remember that the lore at least goes that the dwarves, you cannot really tell male from female because the ladies also have beards and also have like the same physique and stuff. It's not very easy to tell.
Are you sure that that's not the Terry Pratchett version? Because his dwarves were like that.
I think it's not.
Okay.
But take it with a grain of salt because I only read the Hobbit once. I wasn't a fan, and not much of a fan. Let's say. Let's put it that way. And I only read the appendices once because I didn't have any other Lord of the Rings to read. So I read the appendices.
Man, I remember reading The Hobbit when I was in school, and it was the scene with Gollum was terrifying. It was so scary. One of the early horror literary experiences I had.
Interesting.
Very effective, I thought, the voice in the dark.
Yeah, he created an interesting character and an interesting scene in that I think it's spoilt by watching The Lord of the Rings first. It's you develop those characters in The Hobbit, and then they grow up in Lord of the Rings. So you can't go back. It's just the wrong order to go in.
And that also holds for the books, not just the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely have to go to read the Hobbit first. Yeah, it takes you into the childhood of the Middle Earth, and the Lord of the Rings takes you into the adulthood of the world. So it grows up very much so. War and tragedy and loss. You don't get that in the Hobbits. You only get that hinted at with what happens with the battle with against Smaug. And how the dwarves think that Bilbo betrayed them, which is a very, very strong emotional note it's the strongest emotional note in the Hobbit. But yeah, whereas Lord of the Rings has a lot more of those. This whole topic of adaptations, Ross, is interesting. We could go on and on and on. There's so many things that I'd like to bring up, but I don't think we really have time for that.
Yeah, same here. I mean, there's the thing on Netflix and everything, like taking old movies and expanding them into series with sometimes with success.
That's
Fargo
an interesting
is
adaptation.
Several season series. Interesting adaptation. From Dusk Till Dawn, they turned into a series. I got bored with it after a few episodes.
Oh, really?
But that was interesting, I guess. I like what they did with Fargo, where they take the kind of the setting and the vibe and they sort of. That's very much about mining the essence out of the movie, and they're not retelling the movie. They're not using the same characters, but it's like those types of characters, that type of environment, and those themes. Bates Motel, I also thought which is more of a prequel to Psycho, but set in the modern day. I thought that was great. And where they really stuck to the truth of the character and the themes of the movie. and it worked well as a prequel. They didn't go too far. It's like, yeah, you could sort of see this leading into that movie, but they didn't feel the need to set the prequel in the 40s, which I was glad of personally. Like everyone's got cell phones, smartphones, but they were still able to tell a very similar, to show the same character, the same themes, and a similar kind of story. So that was a great one, I thought.
Oh, well, that's quite interesting how you bring that up. You know, we sort of touched on the idea of modernization and the changes that can have to stories. But that has been going on for a long time, like with plays. You know, you'll see Shakespeare set in whatever era that it's played in. But okay, so you've thrown up the idea of like the Netflix series and stuff like that. I recently watched a bit of Pitface's favorite horror series, the Haunting of Hill House.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so this is
based on an old novel.
Yes,
1960 or something.
50s.
50s.
It's a novel written in the 50s, and in the TV version, it seems to be set. Okay, so you've got the terrible haunting that happened to these children in their childhood, and then you follow them into adulthood and see how it's affected them. In the TV show, they show that childhood happening in the 80s, I believe, and then the adulthood back in the 2000s. So you have it's a future setting, and so you obviously have to change it accordingly. You know, there are things you have to change about the world and stuff like that. Some things that don't quite fit, like the house being looked after by caretakers. You know, this woman who acts as a maid and this man who acts as a handyman or whatever it is. Like, you didn't really have that in the 80s. So, whereas that you still had that in the 1950s and 60s as a hangover from when that existed in, you know, the old days. So that is rather a weird note, and there's certain aspects of the film that are quite weird. I mean, the house is super gothic in the way it's sort of set up, which, you know, weren't too many of those houses left in the 1980s anywhere.
Yeah, it'd be strange to see something like that.
Yeah, like super gothic, like ridiculously so. So yeah, it's quite weird. But yeah, it's interesting in the way that things are adapted and the choices that people make when they adapt things. But this was, I think, universally regarded as a very popular adaptation. People like this TV version, Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah.
Not so much me, because I'm not into horror, but yeah, it's quite popular with other people.
Yeah, it was good. I liked it. I wasn't crazy about how it ended, but, you know, it's hard to end horror stories. The endings are always, well, can be a little challenging.
Usually the ending of a horror story is, you've defeated the bad thing, you've defeated it. Not really.
We need the sequel.
Yeah, or you need... Yeah, you either need a sequel or you need to hint that the audience should still be afraid.
Right.
In some way.
It was more like I found this has nothing to do with the subject of the podcast today, but I just found it to be they tried to explain too much. It was a little too like on the nose and like tying everything up. So yeah, that wasn't super crazy, but although I liked the characters a lot, I thought it was a good show.
Oh.
The characters and stuff, I guess. But, yeah, better before it ended.
All right. Well, we should end the QUACKCAST, actually.
Yes, I was going to say we could say the same thing about this episode before I started talking. Yes. Should have cut that part.
Thank you very much for listening to QUACKCAST number 467. I'm Ozone Ocean, and thank you, Tarns and Baines.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.